Okay, part two about the War on Terror. Um, so there is documentation that shows that, for the most part, Muslims and Jews were actually quite close. They believed in some ways that the Islamic faith was almost an extension of Judaism. They shared a lot of the same prophets and believed in the Hebrew prophets as part of their faith. But it was Muhammad that changed a lot of it. And after Muhammad, which was around the 9th century, I believe, the violent strain that we now think of whenever we think of Islam or Muslims in many ways, began. The Quran may have preceded that, but a lot of stuff was changed to include sayings and thinkings of the Prophet Muhammad. And much of that exists even today in any Quran you might read, talking about infidels and how to treat them, talking about the enemies of Islam and keeping them at bay, or if they don't convert, killing them. And a lot of stuff is actually in the Quran itself and the Hadith. And people will ignore that when they try to protect the religion of Islam, or to rationalize the actions of people who are acting out violently against the West. They conveniently ignore what is known now, or should have been known for a long time, about the actual writings in the Quran. Now, some of it talks about peaceful things, mundane things, benign things, banal things. A lot of stuff is common in all religious texts, histories and ideas and blah, blah, blah. But there is some things in there, in the Quran, that do not exist in any other religious text, whether it's the New Testament, the Old Testament, or any other testament. Violent tracts, violent phrases, paragraphs, not only talking about violence, but mandating it as a response to certain things a Muslim person might come across. The hatred of the West began then. And the need to conquer the world, and specifically the Western civilization, began then. Out of that time period came the first attacks against the West. The sacking of Jerusalem in the 11th century led to the First Crusades. Now, our previous president got his history wrong. Oh, there's a shock. When he said that Christians were just as guilty because of the Crusades in violence in the name of their religion as Muslims. So, in other words, he was equivocating in order to rationalize bad behavior. What else does a liberal do? But he had his history wrong. Oh, yes, there were some subsequent crusades, there were 4 in all, I believe, that led to a lot of violence on both sides. But what started it was the Muslim attack against the holy city of Jerusalem. And the Christians who found Jerusalem because of Jesus to be a holy site for Christianity took umbrage. Prior to that, there was no connection between Islam and Jerusalem. They only claimed it because it was Christian and to some degree Jewish, but the Jewish thing was not as important as the Christian thing at the time. I don't think. Either way, it was a twofer, and they went after it successfully. And the First Crusade fought to get it back. And it did. And the Christians held it until it was attacked again. And then they lost it. And during this period of time, when Jerusalem was under the rule of Islam, buildings were built that now become sacred, histories were made, and they claimed Jerusalem as their own. And subsequent crusades fought to get it back, get the wealth out of it, save artifacts, etc., etc. But the attacks started from the Muslims. So the idea that there's some equivocation here is ludicrous. It's not all the same. Sometimes who starts these fights is as important as who wins them, and as important as who fights them. And this is one of those cases. It was also the beginning of an entire movement within Islam to create a caliphate and to conquer as much Western land and as much land as possible. And as such, and out of the Crusades and after them, the next boldish move came in the 15th century, the beginning of the Ottoman Empire, which conquered Central Europe first, much of it, and moved its way west. It got into as far as Spain and the Moors, northern Africa, all the way to the west coast of Africa. And at one point, the Ottoman Empire was bigger than the Roman Empire. And it lasted longer. In fact, the Ottoman Empire was not actually physically totally dissolved until 1924. 6 years after World War I. Now that is hard to believe, but it's true. And all that time, a caliphate was established. There was much of the history of Islam and Muslims in this world, much of the stories like Aladdin and flying carpets and some of the great stuff, inventions and other things came from this great empire. Sometimes good things come out of bad things, but a lot of interesting things happened in that time. But then it was dissolved. But what people fail to understand is it was not forgotten. It was never actually dissolved up here. And it was never a case where they went into the Quran and crossed out all the violent stuff. It still remained in the Quran. Also, what people in the West especially didn't understand or didn't want to understand is that the movement, the violent strain that Muhammad put into the Islamic faith was not going anywhere. That it has a certain nature about it, a recurring nature about it, that it might succeed for a while and then not succeed, but it lays dormant. It does not disappear. And it bides its time, and it waits. And then, when people aren't paying attention, or they got enough power or money or influence or weapons or whatever, it rears its ugly head again. And it's already shown to do that. You had the Crusades, and then there was a period where they kind of disappeared a little bit. And then you had the Ottoman Empire, and then there was a period of time where it disappeared a little bit. About 40 years. And in the 1960s, it started to raise its ugly head again. Saddam Hussein was just one of many changes, of many people who tried to change the face of the Middle East once again in the favor of their version of Islam. Whether it was Shia or Sunni, in their case Sunni, they were bound and determined to take violent control of as many regions as possible. Throughout the 70s, they built up money. Some countries got rich from finding oil, making deals with Western countries, all with a different agenda out there that nobody knew about. The Ayatollahs took over a country in Iran that was wealthy beyond anyone's imagination. So they basically stole their power and wealth. And on it goes. The Saud family in Saudi Arabia became multi-billionaires almost overnight from the discovery of oil. And the Kuwaitis and this, that, and the other. Some of them did bad things with the money and the power. Some were somewhat benign and quiet, too small to make any noise, whatever. But throughout this time, all these Middle Eastern countries suddenly were getting more powerful. They started to become a source of energy for the West, and they used it as leverage against the West. They formed an alliance, the OPEC nations, the OPECers, as we used to call them back in the 70s, who held the carrot of oil over the heads of the West and made us dependent on them. And that got them more wealth. It led to energy shortages and other things, because they were dealt with stupidly. They were believed to be benign or just businessmen without no other agenda. We didn't understand history because people in charge weren't paying attention to history. Here we go again. We don't learn from history, so we're doomed to repeat it. And we are repeating it now. Thanks, guys. And so they got bolder. It wasn't enough to take our money. It wasn't enough to hold oil over our heads. Now we're going to start attacking. Now we're going to start taking hostages. So we had the Iran hostage deal in 1979. Now we're going to start going after military bases. So in the early 80s, we took a truck and put an explosive on it and rammed the Marines barracks in Beirut. Ooh, that was fun. Ooh, we're going to go after some embassies now. And we're going to go do some other things. Isn't this fun? And look at the West. They don't know what to do. They don't know whether to shit or go blind. Well, aren't we just the coolest folks on the planet? We're terrorizing these folks, and it's fun. And we're getting headlines, and we're getting noticed, and we're getting recruits and people joining our side because we're thumbing our nose at the West. We've been in a war on terrorism as the recipients of their terror, the victims, if you will, for decades and decades. And quite frankly, the war on terror goes back to the 9th century. If you really want to think about it. It wasn't called terror back then. Many of these were terrorist attacks. They were just out and out wars. So if you really want to call it what it is, it's been a battle against Islam, or the violent nature of Islam. There are a lot of Islamicists and a lot of Muslims who are peace-loving. They must ignore the violent strain that is built in, thanks to Muhammad, into their religion. And you'd think that if they had enough gumption, power, influence, they could rise up as a subgroup within the religion and take it over and end once and for all the violent tendencies of their religion. Many of them would like to do so. I hear tell of it, but it never happens. The violence always wins out. And the people who would perpetrate violence always win out. And the people who are supposedly non-violent are rarely heard from, or when they do talk, nobody's listening, not enough people are listening, or nothing gets done about it. So they got their own problems too. I'm always amazed at how little you hear from the peace-loving supposed Muslims when violence in their name in the name of their religion is perpetrated. You'd think that they'd be all over the place screaming bloody murder against the bad actors who are wrongfully representing Islam. The problem is they can't, because it's not wrongly representing Islam. That is Islam. That's been made Islam. So when we say fundamentalist, we don't need to say extremist, because the fundamental roots of Islam are extreme in their nature and violent in their nature. This is not an offshoot of Islam. This is not a coup taken over by violent groups of Islam. This is Islam. Sorry to burst your bubble, folks, but Islam has become and has been for centuries a violent religion. Now, Christians have been violent. Wars have been started in the name of Christian religion. I'm sure Jews have been violent, started wars in their time, prior to the Christians maybe, in the name of their religion. Religion is a thing that is very personal and incites a lot of emotion. Sometimes it's not good and leads to bad things like war, or things like intolerance, like the Inquisition. But these are fleeting moments in the histories of religions. They're usually marked by long periods of peace and tolerance and understanding and a rebirth of the religion. Except Islam. It is mostly violent with small periods of peace, which are actually periods of biding their time and waiting till they can be violent again. Completely opposite. In our next segment, we'll talk about the modern war on terror and what we've decided and should decide to do about it. See you then.